Hey, beautiful people, you have now entered a place of praise, purpose, and prayer. Welcome back to the small group series, Month of Men. My name is Brother Leonard, and I am here to talk to you about building the wall and standing in the gap. Let's go. How's it going, VIP? My name is Brother Leonard, and I am here to bring your small group lesson today. I am super excited. Today, we're going to talk about standing in the gap and building up that wall. And actually, what happens when we don't stand in the gap and when we don't support in building up that wall. All right. Today, we're coming to you from Ezekiel 22 and 30. And I like to give a couple of different translations. So first, we're going to start with the NIV, and then we'll move into the NLT. All right. The NIV states, I look for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land, so I would not have to destroy it. Looking at that NLT version, I look for someone who might rebuild the wall of righteousness that guards the land. I search for someone to stand in the gap in the wall, so I wouldn't have to destroy the land, but I found no one. So God is out here looking for men to stand in the gap. And excuse me, ladies, this is the month of men, so I'm gonna be focused on the men, but also know that you can stand in that gap and you can build up that wall as well. But I gotta focus on my men this week. So look, thinking back on the background of this lesson, it's actually it's really humbling, right? So when I was young, I was a part of this youth group, and one of the many lessons that were taught to me in that youth group was Ezekiel 22 and 30. This was one that stood out to me the most, just because it really called for us to really live for Christ, to really stand in that gap, to really go in and build up that wall, and really it calls for a task of you to do something. And so that's why it really stuck with me throughout these years. I read this verse when I was first 14 years old. Shout out to Brother Tony Gladney for introducing just the love of Christ into my life and blessing me with this verse that really stuck with me all my life, right? And so what does it mean when we say standing in the gap? What does it mean when we talk about building up the wall, right? So back in the Bible, in the biblical times, the only thing that would protect the city was the high walls, right? And so there were men who would watch those walls. There were men who would, if there was any breach in the walls or any holes or any openings in the wall, they would have to hastily go in and fill that gap. Because if they didn't fill that gap, then it allowed for the enemy to step in, right? And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about standing in that gap. We're asking, who is going to stand in that gap for God? Who is going to stand up for the people of the land and proclaim his righteousness, proclaim his justice, and hastily chase after him, right? So in Ezekiel 22, God is describing the disastrous state that Israel is in, right? And the many of sins that they have committed against him. They were worshiping idols. They were sacrificing their kids to those same idols. And so God is really portraying that picture in the whole chapter of Ezekiel 22. He used Ezekiel to stand in that gap for the people, Ezekiel was kind of like a prophet, right? So he brought the message of God to the people of Israel and then calling them to repent. Similar to Moses, right? God has consistently and historically found men in the Bible who answered that calling, who stood in that gap, right? Now looking specifically at Ezekiel 22 and 30, God is expressing his disappointment for the leaders. I'm gonna say that again. God is expressing his disappointment for the leaders, right? It's one thing to be a follower, but we know that the wrath is a little bit harsher on leaders because we're supposed to know. We're supposed to have that discernment. We're supposed to have that relationship with God. We're supposed to be in constant communication with him. And so the punishment or the judgment is a little bit harsher on the leaders, right? And so and he's expressing his disappointment for the leaders for their failing to uphold the justice and righteousness, allowing the people amongst them to worship false idols, allowing the people among them to worship, to sacrifice their children to those same false idols. God was searching for someone to stand in the gap and to build up that wall. But in this situation, he found no one. In this situation, he found no one. So standing in the gap, that means in a spiritual sense, it means interceding on somebody's behalf. It means advocating on somebody's behalf. It means stepping up to fill those roles in leadership and to protect, right? That's what it means to stand in that gap. That's what God is calling us men to do, to stand in that gap. Again, I already talked about building up that wall, but when I thought about building up the wall, and forgive me if I can't say this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. But when I thought about building up the wall, I thought about Game of Thrones. Now I know I'm late. I just started Game of Thrones, and it is, man, it's good. But in Game of Thrones, they have this huge wall that is keeping the night watchers or that's keeping the crawlers out, right? And they have men patrolling that wall all day, 24/7, looking for any breaches, looking for any gaps. And if they do find a breach and if they do find a gap, they immediately go in and fix it because they know what can enter in if they do not fill that gap. Right. And so looking at Game of Thrones, they got the night watchers. Right. And so if they don't fill that gap, those night watchers are coming over that wall and they're coming to destroy the city. Same thing in that ancient time, right? In the biblical times, the cities were protected by those great walls. Anybody, once you infiltrated the city and got through those walls, a lot of times you were able to conquer the city. And so protecting those walls and building up those walls and standing in the gap was super important for not only the men, but for the women as well. You see, I gave y'all a little point right there, women. And so, but looking at this month of men, I am challenging the men to figure out ways that they can stand in the gap. Figure out ways where you can help in supporting and building up that wall. Figure out ways that you can not only stand in the gap in your home, but in your community. And this is a personal calling in the church here in VIP. What are some ways that you can stand in that gap? What are some ways that you can help build up that wall? What are some areas or some holes that you see that can be filled by you? Man, we need you. We need you. I know with me personally, it was always thinking like, I kind of shied away from leadership. I shied away from being participatory in church. I would come in, and I would just say it because it's truthful. I would come in like at 10 o'clock, get Bishop's word, and then get on down, right? But I've really been challenging myself. I've really been challenging myself to really step out, to really to really step in the gap, to really help VIP, to really help my community of Stockton, to really help my household build up a strong, solid wall so that the enemy cannot infiltrate, so that the enemy cannot come in and destroy what God is doing on the other side of this wall, right? And then, somebody told me once, because I always kind of talked about like, oh, I'm not living perfectly. I'm not living the best life. And who am I to tell somebody how to live if I'm not living that way as well, right? But something stuck out to me. And somebody told me, and I don't know, it might have been Bishop, but somebody told me like, God does not choose the prepared, he prepares the chosen. And that right there was mind blowing for me. That let me know that all I have to do is say yes. God will prepare me the rest. All I have to do is say yes. The things that are the fleshly things that are weighing on me, God is going to work that out. Just like he's going to work it out in you. Just like he's going to work it out in you. And so just saying yes to standing in that gap, just saying yes to help building up that wall, just saying yes to being that man that God has called you to be, right? Because if not, Ezekiel 22:31, it gives us the consequences of what happens when we fail to stand in the gap and we fail to build up that wall. So I will pour out my wrath on them and consume them with my fiery anger, bringing down on their own heads all they have done, declares the sovereign God. And I don't know about y'all, but I don't want that. I don't want that at all. And so I'm going to do my part to continue to challenge and press forward to stand in the gap, not only for my household, but for my community and for our very own VIP. And I hope that you'll do the same, man.
Thank you, Leonard, for that wonderful lesson. Wasn't that a good lesson? I hope you had or have a good time with the questions, discussing them. Be honest. Honesty is the only thing that helps us. Be honest and be transparent about where you are so God can help you get where he needs you to go. I want to invite you to Victory and Praise. If you don't know, we have church every Sunday at 9 a.m. at 2029 East Harding Way in the blessed city of Stockton. It's blessed because God's people are here. Just in case you're wondering why it's blessed, that's why. Come on out. Come on out and experience the difference yourself. Don't take my word for it. Come see for yourself. Thank you, and God bless.